do miracles still occur today? And if they do occur, how would we ever notice or how would we ever recognize it? And why is there so much hesitancy to accept the idea of miracles in today's culture? We'll talk about that on today's broadcast.
J. Warner Wallace is a cold case homicide detective who's been investigating cold case murders in Los Angeles County for over a decade. His work has been featured on Fox News, Dateline, and Court TV. Now, we join him as he applies his investigative skills to making a case for Christianity.
Thanks for joining us on today's broadcast. I'm Jimmy Wallace.
And I'm J. Warner Wallace. So, Jimmy, we're going to start talking about miracles, but what's the point of today's show?
Well, I think that we all hold a number of presuppositions about miracles, whether we're Christians or non-believers, and I think that a lot of our assumptions about reality kind of prevent us or help us to accept miracles. I want to discuss those and see if there's some way we can maybe find some common ground for how we can address this idea of miracles, whether we're believers or not today. What is it that we can kind of think through to help us to identify miracles when they happen, or even just accept the idea, can miracles happen to begin with?
Yeah, and I think this is really coming a large part from an article that you wrote on our website at coldcasechristianity.com, and I'm just opening it up here. It's called how bias can impact the way you consider miracles. And I bring it up because this is we've got a book we're going to talk about in the second part of the show that addresses this as well. And I know that in your thinking on this, I always think, well, look, I had reasons as a non-believer why I could have walked by 1,000 things you could attribute to God, and I never would have attributed any of those things to God. I would have said it was happen chance, it was luck, never gave it a second thought. I was so committed to my naturalistic worldview. But you've identified in this article a couple of classic statements, one a little older than the other, that help us to see what kind of bias we're really facing with people who don't believe there's a God. So let me just ask you first to talk about your article and some of the things you actually saw and wrote about in your article in terms of the kinds of bias that's out there.
Yeah, I tried to, there's been a number of people who've talked and written about miracles, and so I think it's hard to, in a single article, summarize all the diversity of opinions on miracles, but I try to pick a couple well-known people and take their thoughts, people who've given a lot of thought to this idea of miracles, and kind of see where are they coming from. And both these guys, David Hume and I've chosen Bart Ehrman, they both are non-Christians, non-believers, discussing the idea of miracles and what's their position on it as non-believers. Now, David Hume, he was a very famous philosopher. He was writing in the 1700s, and he wrote this about miracles. No testimony is sufficient to establish a miracle unless the testimony be of such a kind that its falsehood would be more miraculous than the fact that it endeavors to establish. Now, he's writing in the 1700s. That's a little bit older language, but essentially, he's in Hume's perspective, he would argue that the only evidence for miracles is testimony, personal testimony, the kind that you hear even today. People will say, oh, God performed a miracle in my life, and we can accept or reject it in Hume's mind on the basis just of that testimony. And his feeling was that not only do we only have testimony to consider, but that testimony would need to be so extremely reliable that it would be almost like a miracle in of itself, that it would be true, and that would be the only way that Hume would accept that a miracle had occurred. It's a very high standard, and he's not going to accept things that are not testimony. Bart Ehrman, on the other hand, I also mentioned this article, he's a still living New Testament scholar, maybe the foremost New Testament scholar in the world, but not a Christian.
Well, at least the best known, at least, right? Because he's not a Christian New Testament scholar, but he is really probably better known than most Christians, right?
Yes, and yeah, I'm not saying that because I accept everything he says and we disagree on a lot of things, but he's certainly very well educated and spends a lot of time in the area of the New Testament and Christianity. But in a talk, he said this about miracles. He says, miracles are not impossible. I won't say they're impossible. I'm just going to say that miracles are so highly improbable that they're the least possible occurrence in any given instance. Okay. And so for him, Ehrman would start out with just the assumption that if someone is claiming a miracle has occurred, that is the least possible or least reasonable explanation for any event. So if there's something that we can point to and say, hey, I think that might have been a miracle, in Ehrman's mind, the miracle is the least reasonable explanation. If there's another possible explanation we could give, Ehrman would say that that other explanation is always going to be more possible or more reasonable to believe.
Yeah, so it kind of sounds like the issue then is, okay, if there's another possible explanation that could be offered, he wants to defer to that. Okay, I get it. So a lot of what we're trying to talk about in this section, and the next section especially, is going to be, well, how do we eliminate the other possible explanations so that we know that our inference that this is a miracle is most... Look, if this was common, we wouldn't call it a miracle, right? So we know these are improbable, uncommon events. That's why we called them miracles to begin with. The only question is, okay, so what you obviously see some bias there that you kind of unpack in the article. So what are you seeing?
I think at least with Ehrman, I think that if he's going to say that from the outset that any other possible explanation will always be more reasonable, I think that that's actually a pretty big presupposition to bring. I think if we can think of any type of miracle, we said we saw a vision of something really spectacular. Maybe in that particular instance, Ehrman could come up with an explanation that is more reasonable. Oh, it was a psychological phenomenon. Okay, it's totally possible, and we can discuss each individual circumstance on its own merits. Right. But I think to just blanketly say that always there's going to be an alternate explanation, I think that assumes actually what type of miracles we're going to encounter, what type of explanations could be given. I think that it doesn't actually logically follow that the miracle will be always the least reasonable. I think each individual claim of a miracle needs to be taken on its own merits. And many times, I'm sure you'd agree, there's many claims of miracles that are out there that we would not accept, even as Christians. Sure. Maybe for other Christians, certainly as a Christian, we would probably look at miracle claims from other religions and say, hey, I don't know if that really occurred the way that they said it did. So it's not that we're, as Christians, saying we should always accept miracles. But I think all we're saying is that as we see each miracle claim, we should just take it on its own merits, on whatever evidence we have for that particular miracle. And if it's not a reasonable explanation, or there's a more reasonable explanation from some natural mechanism, I'm okay accepting that. But if the miracle is the most reasonable explanation, I want to start off at least being open-minded enough to say, maybe I would accept it then, if it was the most reasonable explanation. You
know, interesting in both of these folks too are not really established. Like this, if we're saying, hey, this is not reasonable, there ought to be a framework that we might use in our own minds to kind of get to that point. In other words, like, what is the template? What is the test that you're running these through? Do you have a systematic test? But to make blanket statements, right? That means you're not even willing, like. What are you? We all actually probably have a test in our mind of some sort, some way that we're filtering these claims to just from our own personal opinion. Think, well, I don't think that's actually, or I do think that actually is. But you're probably running it through some kind of filter. I think part of the problem too, would you agree, is that we often see brothers and sisters in the faith who will point to all kinds of things that even maybe other Christians would say, oh, okay, I'm not sure that that's a miracle. But identify these as miracles so that the unbelieving world watches us do this, where everything we attest, everything to God. If any event that occurs today, I attest it, I attribute it to God. To God's, not just God's being the author and the creator of everything in the universe, and therefore He is the sustainer of all things, but that God is actively intervening and interceding and changing the course of natural events in order to achieve some purpose. That's, I think, the thing that non-believers look at us and they think, you think that God is constantly puppet stringing everything in your life? And they think we're silly when we do that.
Yeah, but, I mean, how many times have you heard, at least I've heard of this a lot, people, non-believers will mock like the athlete, the high school athlete who at the end of the football game, or college athlete, he's getting interviewed and attributes it, God gave us this win, we prayed before that we were going to win and beat the other team, and people will mock that, like, what does God care about your football game?
Right.
And as a
like
Christian,
the other team didn't also pray for this, and he didn't answer their prayers, so now is your team better in terms of God's, I get it. Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I think that even if it was true that God caused the outcome of the football game, even if that was true as a Christian, I kind of I resonate with the non-believer. Like, yeah, I don't know if that's the best look for us, I guess. And I think you're right that we all have, or I think we should at least develop some type of test. You know, when we look at Ehrman's quote, he just kind of wants to flat out say miracles are always the least reasonable. Hume, he does offer a test. I don't know that it's the most reasonable test, but he does offer a test, and I think that we can give him some props for that. He says, hey, I want to look at testimony, and I want to make sure that this is like such excellent testimony that I can't help but accept it. So at least he's willingly hear one type of evidence, although he's pretty skeptical of it. I think that we probably could think about things more broadly. I don't even think we necessarily need testimony or like to trust the word of a person to conclude that an event occurred. One of the great approaches to like the claim of the resurrection that we've heard from apologist Gary Habermas, he'll offer this minimal facts approach. But what he will try to do, without getting too deep into it, is he'll offer just a couple historical facts, like the fact that Jesus died, the fact that the disciples seem to have changed lives, and he'll say that based on just these facts that are not testimony, we're not trusting just the word of a person, but these are historical facts that most historians would agree on, that based on just those types of evidences, Habermas would conclude, then Jesus must have risen from the dead.
Right.
I think that in the end, we needed to figure out what counts as evidence for the case, and then based on that kind of framework, now we can go to any miracle claim and test it against our framework, our worldview of how are we going to test evidences. Now we can evaluate each miracle individually to see, does it really stand the test? Is it really reasonable to believe that a miracle occurred?
Yeah, I think what we're doing is that whole idea of abductive reasoning. Right? We've got several explanations for this event, this miracle, whatever it may be. And then the question becomes, which of these explanations is most reasonable? And I think that's kind of what we're doing in every single crime scene. This is what jurors do when they assess the different claims in a jury trial. You know, they've got one explanation from the prosecutor, one explanation from the defense team. Which of these makes more sense given the evidence? And so I think the question becomes, and this is what I think Gary does really, really well too, right? Is that he's written on these kinds of things. But let's take a break. And when we come back, there's actually an author that you and I both know, who has written a book on this recently, and I want to just kind of review that book real quickly, because he offers a template by which we could examine any event and determine if it's a miracle. And we'll do that right after the break.
Jay Warner and Susie Wallace have written 3 kids' books to help children know the truth and defend it in the public square. All 3 books mirror Jay Warner's adult books, chapter by chapter. And best yet, the kids' books are written as fictional stories that will turn your kids into detectives as they solve mysteries and learn about Christianity. There's also an interactive academy website at casemakersacademy.com, where your kids can join other cadets and complete their own academy notebook. Each course has free videos, activity sheets, and more. Your young readers can even earn their own Junior Detective graduation certificates and appear on the Honor Cadet Wall. Be sure to visit casemakersacademy.com to learn more.
Be sure to download the free Cold Case Christianity app from the iTunes Store and the Android Marketplace. The Cold Case Christianity app puts all the resources from coldcasechristianity.com in the palm of your hand. You can read the daily blog, listen to podcasts, and watch videos from within the application, and Jim uses the app to send direct messages to fans of Cold Case Christianity. The app will also link you to all Cold Case Christianity social media and provide you with a direct connection to J. Warner Wallace. Download the app today and become a better Christian casemaker.
So I know one of the big questions that we always hear about when we hear about miracles is this question: what even constitutes a miracle? What is a miracle? How could we identify it? Now, I know J.P. Moreland's just recently written a book all on this topic, and I think you wanted to get in on a little bit, a few of the points that he makes in that.
Yeah, it's called A Simple Guide to Experiencing Miracles. I'm going to hold it up here so you guys can see it in our little time frame here. But the idea here, and JP, you know, as a friend, I'm actually an endorser of this book on the inside cover. He's done a great job. of kind of parsing through this. And I thought rather than I try to summarize it, I'm just going to read to you from, as you know, I'm a part of Colson Center, and our Colson Center Breakpoint has a little discussion of JP's book. And here's what it says. In his new book, A Simple Guide to Experiencing Miracles, Instruction and Inspiration for Living Supernaturally in Christ, renowned Christian philosopher J.P. Moreland makes a provocative claim. 95% of what the average evangelical church accomplishes in a given year, suggests Moreland, could be explained even if God didn't exist. In other words, too much of our sermons, programs, and worship could be explained away and perhaps even dismissed by outsiders as due to skillful leadership, public speaking, and production quality. No work of God required. Now, that's interesting that that's a summary that's first being said. So I love the fact that JP believes and understands that God is still active in his creation and he is still engaged, but we often will work as if he's not. We often will work as if there's no supernatural. Like there are folks, for example, who believe that all kinds of miracles of this nature really stopped at the closing of the apostolic age. You know, these miracles were attesting to the apostolic authority of the apostles, but then all miracles stop, and God's not acting that way in the world anymore. These are cessationists, right? I'm not that kind of a person myself, but I also am suspicious as a detective. Here's what Moreland says in terms of definitions. True to his profession is the article. This is the Breakpoint article again. By the way, the Breakpoint article is written by John Stonestreet and Shane Morris. They are making these Breakpoint broadcasts. They're about a minute. You, for example, growing up, were always listening to these podcasts. As a matter of fact, I remember, as an aside, that you sent a letter to Chuck Colson back when he was doing these and supported him with your tithes for a number of years. And he wrote you a letter to say how much he appreciated the fact that you, at the age of, what was it, maybe, I don't know, 10, 12? What was it? I don't even know how old you were.
Yeah, they used to play like a 1 minute little clip of Chuck Colson.
Yeah, this is the Breakpoint broadcast.
Like the 5 o'clock or 4 o'clock hour on a local radio channel. I think it was syndicated, but my local radio channel in Orange County. And I would listen to that, I think, starting probably in elementary school, leading up probably into high school at least. And I would always, that was like one of my favorite little clips because he had a way of saying things so succinctly. I wish, I'm still trying to get to the point where I could say something so succinctly as him in a single minute, make an entire point, or minute and a half, however long he was talking. And so I was always really motivated by that, and I think his personal story really drove me too. So I was a huge Chuck Colson fan, in his life, still today, I guess.
Yeah, well, now I get a chance to serve with them. So let me continue reading the article. This is the Breakpoint, been transcribed. Okay, so this is about a minute and a half total. But what he says is, Moreland in this book, he does provide an amazing collection of miracle accounts and different amazing stories, but that's not where he stops. But he starts by defining his terms. A miracle, he says, is a, quote, supernatural intervention, unquote, into the course of natural events, either by God or an angelic being. Included in Moreland's definition would be those answers to prayer that come through what theologians call, quote unquote, providence, in which God works events together toward specific ends. Now, what's interesting about this, and I want you to read the book. It's a great book. It's very short. It's really powerful. It's quick read. It's a page turner. So I highly recommend JP's book. But what's interesting about JP is he's a lot like, we came to the same kinds of conclusions in two different ways. Because JP, in this book, he has a kind of a funnel point. Like, how would you, we were talking before the break about how do you test miracles to know that this is not just some other explanation is better. Here's what he says. This is, of course, again, from the summary of the Breakpoint Minute. A true miracle, according to JP, must contain or must meet two criteria. First, it must be very improbable. In other words, not something that typically happens by accident. Okay, duh. And second, it must be independently meaningful. That's an interesting way to approach it. Or have specificity, quote unquote. It must answer a prayer or fulfill a need that clearly shows God is at work. And by applying these two principles, Moreland believes it's possible to distinguish miracles from coincidences in almost perfect accuracy and give God the glory he deserves as a result. Okay, I only bring this up because we were talking about how Hume did kind of give a template. At least, he's talking about it from the lens of testimony. And I think that's really the trick for us. I mean, why am I so skeptical? I get this all the time, Jimmy, where, and you probably have experienced this too, where people will say to me, well, look, when you're working a homicide, you don't investigate ghosts and other supernatural. Like, all your investigations appear to be entirely materialistic and naturalistic, yet you say you believe in these immaterial supernatural things. Well, you're never going to say, okay, gentlemen, I think this. I actually addressed this issue in one of the first chapters of Cold Case Christianity. I'm not going to default to some supernatural cause when I've got evidence in the room that best describes a natural cause. So the question becomes, what is the template we're going to use to distinguish between these two things? So I'm going to throw this out to you. A couple of years ago, before JP wrote the book or even sent me a manuscript to review, I was asked by a Hollywood producer to work on a series for cable, which never came to be, in which we would take a cold case or investigator's detective's approach to claims about the supernatural, right? This event occurred and it wasn't going to be like Christian supernatural. It could be a ghost or, all kinds of paranormal kind of stuff. And the idea is, do we ever get to a point where as an investigator, you'd have to say, oh yeah, we've got good evidence that there is something supernatural occurring here. I said, okay, well, we might find something that is hard to explain, but I think I have to develop an investigative template. So here are the 4 M's. You saw that JP has his, is it specific and is it improbable? I had my 4 as well. But before I even launch those out to you, Jimmy, what do you think? When you have other fellow Christians who will ask you this question, or say make a claim about something supernatural occurred, what is that kind of thing in your mind? You're probably filtering it. You're probably thinking, well, did this? In other words, we all have some reason why we would reject someone's miracle claim. What do you find are the things that give you the most pause when people make miracle claims?
I think I'm often thinking about when I'm talking about miracles. I think I'm often thinking about what are the examples I could give to someone who's not a Christian that they would accept. So it's not necessarily that I would J.P. Moreland. He's giving us a list of criteria that hold things to a pretty high bar, where you've got to have something that's extremely improbable in order to say that it's a miracle. Now, I don't know that I would say that God cannot act in ways, when we see the pastor who's got a very successful, growing congregation, it's not that I would necessarily say that God cannot be behind his success.
Right.
But I think that I can recognize that for the skeptic, for the person who's not a Christian, they can easily attribute that success to something else. And it would be reasonable for them to say, well, maybe their success is because they're very charismatic, they're a great speaker, or they're just very entertaining. Music is really good at the worship team. And so right. I'm looking for a miracle that would be clear to the skeptic, to the person who is antagonistic to Christianity, because then I know that in trying to prove that or argue for that, I'm also going to catch the non-believer who's the seeker. I'm also going to catch the skeptical Christian and the Christian who would just accept anything as a miracle. All those people would also come along if I can get that skeptic. So that's why I think that's sort of where J.P. Moreland's coming from. He's got this high bar because he's trying to convince the person who is extremely skeptical and is not typically looking for miracles. It's not to say that God cannot act in miracles in other ways, cure the believer from cancer in a way that medical science could also provide an answer for. These other miracles might be occurring, but it's just difficult to communicate for them. So I'm looking for a miracle that has very great demonstrable power for the skeptic.
So I'm thinking the same thing. If you're doing a show for mass consumption, you're going to have a lot of skeptics watching. So here's the 4 M's that I suggested we use as the template to determine if something is actually supernatural, is at work. The first one is motive. Now, in other words, the person telling you this, do they have some motive in either sex, money, or power? That's the 3 motives I always talk about on our show. Do they have some reason to lie to me? Because if you're motiveless and you're making this claim about if you're saying, I prayed for this and then it happened, well, I don't know. There's no way to confirm the fact that you prayed for it except to take your word for it, but I'm going to test your motive. Do you have something to gain out of making this kind of claim? And it's going to have to be somebody who is motiveless If you're going to, I would apply this test to anyone. So I'm not being unfair here. So motive is a big one. Do they have a motive to lie to me? If they don't have a motive, I'm more likely to believe they are true. Okay, let me give you the second one. This is the 4 that I actually sent the producer. Second one is materialism. Is there a materialist, naturalistic cause that could explain this? Is there some cause out of space, time, matter, physics, and chemistry that would explain this? If so, why would I jump to something extra natural outside the material world to explain it if there's a better explanation within the material world? I don't know that I would necessarily. Now, look, that's a higher bar. I'm telling you that right away, right? Because God's going to have to work with the material world in order to make it happen. But again, I'm looking for a way to convince the skeptic who might watch the show. Third thing, is there something mysterious about it? What I mean is, otherworldly. Like I can't explain this. Like then I saw an alien. Then there's the video captures this thing that moves by. In other words, is there something that is utterly mysterious, especially like when you're doing a TV show, right? Because they're going to want to see that kind of thing. Like you've watched like the paranormal movies, right? There's a lot of mysterious stuff going on there. Okay, and the last thing is improbable. No, this is an M word, but it sounds like it's improbable. So I'm with JP. It's interesting that he and I land in the same place, even though we had not talked about this. But so it's motive, materialism, mystery, and is it improbable? So if this is something that's pretty common, happens all the time, I'm less likely to attribute it to something that's outside of nature that's causing it. But that was the template that I was using in order to assess whether or not because if there's a better explanation, I think that skeptical audience, and I'm with you. That's why I wanted to ask you that question. I think if it's fair for us to be skeptical. Even JP in his book is saying, hey, it turns out that a lot of what we attribute, I mean, you could do all of this without God's power. That's interesting. So I love the idea that we enter in being as skeptical as possible, because in the end, I'm still going to determine that there are some miracle events that occur in history. And I'm coming at it from a skeptical perspective. It's not like that's the filter I'm going to use to run anything through, even if it's a claim from a Christian. I know we're almost out of time. I want to give you a last 30 seconds. Go.
I think sometimes we can be turned off by miracles because there's this idea that it like breaks the laws of physics or something. But I don't know that necessarily a miracle is even something that's being broken. Just like gravity's acting now, but the cup doesn't fall because I'm holding it. If a God exists who has the power to prevent the laws of nature, the typical laws of nature, from acting for a brief moment in time, then I don't think it's inconsistent or unreasonable to think that a miracle could occur. If a God like that does exist, then I think miracles are very reasonable. And so I don't think we can really exclude them or act like it's somehow crazy for us to believe them.
Yeah, great point. Well, we're out of time, so thanks for joining us this week at Cold Case Christianity. We'll see you back here next week.
To hear more from J. Warner Wallace, please visit coldcasechristianity.com. For more information on this week's topic, visit youtube.com/coldcasechristianity with J. Warner Wallace. Thank you for joining us on this Cold Case Christianity broadcast.